Daniel Cole lost everything in the same week: his job, his home, his dignity. He never imagined the woman who signed his eviction notice and the woman who shared his bed were the same person. For 18 months, he paid rent to a stranger, unaware he was funding his own wife's silence. And the company that fired him? She built it from nothing. When the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just break him, it would break everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and the woman he swore he trusted. If you want to see how deep this secret goes, subscribe and like this video and comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. Daniel Cole had always believed that hard work was the only inheritance a man needed. He'd grown up in a small apartment in Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker, and he carried their lessons like scripture: show up early, keep your word, never take more than you've earned. By 36, he'd built a respectable career as a logistics manager at Halden Freight Solutions, a mid-sized shipping firm that had quietly become one of the top regional carriers in the Midwest. He had a corner cubicle, a decent salary, and, more importantly to him, the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd built it himself. His wife, Vivian, was a different kind of person entirely. Where Daniel was steady and visible, Vivian was elusive, always somewhere between meetings, always vague about what exactly her consulting work involved. She traveled often, sometimes for a week at a time, and she handled money with an ease that Daniel had long ago stopped questioning. He assumed she came from money. Her clothes were tailored, her car was newer than his, and she never once flinched at a restaurant bill. When they married 6 years ago, Daniel had asked her, half joking, "So what is it you actually do?" And Vivian had smiled that soft, unreadable smile of hers and said, "I make sure things run the way they're supposed to." He never pushed harder than that. In hindsight, that would become the great regret of his life. Their home was not extravagant, but it was theirs, or so Daniel believed. A 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane with a wraparound porch and a maple tree Vivian had planted the year they moved in. Daniel paid what he thought was a fair share of the mortgage every month, transferring money into a joint account that Vivian managed. She'd set it up that way early in their marriage. "It's simpler. I'll handle the bills, you handle saving for the future." Daniel, trusting to a fault, never asked to see the deed. He never asked who the mortgage lender was. He never asked really anything at all. The trouble began on an ordinary Tuesday in March, the kind of gray, forgettable morning that gives no warning of the storm to follow. Daniel arrived at Halden Freight at 7:45 a.m., as he always did, coffee in hand, ready to review the week's shipping manifests. He noticed immediately that something was wrong. His badge, which had opened the side entrance every day for the past 4 years, blinked red. He tried again, red. Confused, he walked around to the front lobby where the receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who usually greeted him with a cheerful nod, looked at him with something closer to pity. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "HR is waiting for you in conference room B." Daniel's stomach dropped, though he told himself it was probably nothing, a badge malfunction, a scheduling mix-up. He walked to conference room B with his shoulders squared, still clinging to the version of the morning where everything made sense. It didn't take long for that version to collapse. Behind the table sat Marcus Rain, the director of human resources, flanked by a woman Daniel didn't recognize, and a folder that already had his name neatly printed on the top. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Daniel, we've received serious allegations regarding the Simmons account discrepancy, specifically unauthorized rerouting of a client shipment that resulted in a financial loss of approximately $42,000. Daniel stared at the paper, uncomprehending. "I didn't reroute anything. I flagged that shipment 2 weeks ago because the delivery address didn't match the client's file. I sent an email." "We've reviewed the email chain," the unnamed woman said flatly. "The final authorization came from your login credentials." "That's impossible," Daniel said, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "I was in Cincinnati that day at the regional meeting. Check the calendar, check the parking garage logs, anything." "We understand this is difficult," Marcus said, in the practiced tone of a man who had delivered this speech many times before. "But given the severity of the discrepancy and given company policy on unauthorized account changes, we have no choice but to terminate your employment effective immediately." Daniel sat frozen, the words landing on him like stones. 4 years. 4 years of early mornings, of covering for coworkers, of turning down 2 other job offers because he believed in what they were building. And now, in the span of 11 minutes, it was gone, reduced to a folder, a signature, a red badge. "This is a mistake," he said quietly. "Someone made a mistake." "If you believe there's an error," the woman said, sliding a business card toward him, "you're welcome to file an appeal through our compliance department, but for now, security will escort you to collect your belongings." He remembered very little about walking out of that building. He remembered the cardboard box someone had already prepared for him, half full as though they'd known before he did. He remembered Priya avoiding his eyes. He remembered sitting in his car in the parking lot for 40 minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to understand how the life he'd built so carefully had unraveled in less time than it took to eat breakfast. He didn't call Vivian right away. Some part of him, the part that still clung to pride, wanted to figure it out himself first. He spent the next 3 days combing through his old emails, trying to trace the shipment reroute, trying to find the digital fingerprint of whoever had used his login credentials. He filed the appeal. He got a canned response promising review within 30 business days. He called the compliance line and got voicemail. He was, for the first time in his adult life, powerless in the face of a system that had already decided his guilt. Vivian, when he finally told her, reacted with what he thought at the time was genuine sympathy. She held him that night, told him it was outrageous, told him she'd help him find a lawyer if it came to that. "They'll figure out it wasn't you," she said, stroking his hair as he sat slumped on their bed. "Companies make mistakes like this more than people think." He believed her. He wanted to believe her. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Vivian Cole, née Vivian Hale, was the majority shareholder of Halden Freight Solutions. She had built the company from a single delivery truck and a warehouse lease 17 years ago, long before she'd met Daniel, back when she went by her maiden name in every filing, every contract, every piece of legal paperwork that mattered. She had structured her ownership through a holding company, Meridian Hale Group, precisely so that her name would never appear on an employee's badge, an org chart, or a company directory. To the people who worked there, including her own wife, she was simply a ghost in the numbers, an invisible hand behind the decisions that shaped their working lives. She had married Daniel for reasons that had nothing to do with money or company politics. She loved him deeply in the quiet, unglamorous way that endures long after the initial spark fades. But she had also made a decision early in their relationship never to tell him what she owned. Not out of malice, not even out of secrecy for its own sake. She'd been burned before, by a previous partner who'd only wanted her for what she had, who'd tried to insert himself into her business, who'd nearly cost her everything in a legal battle that still gave her nightmares. With Daniel, she wanted something different. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she controlled. So when he had applied to Halden Freight 4 years into their marriage, a coincidence she still marveled at, still not sure was entirely a coincidence, she had let it happen. She had stayed silent, watched from a distance through quarterly reports and performance reviews, quietly proud every time her name appeared with a positive note attached. She never once used her position to influence his career. Not when he was promoted, not when he was passed over for the regional director role 2 years ago. She kept her hands clean, her involvement invisible, because some part of her believed that if he ever found out, he would feel like everything he'd earned had been handed to him. She wanted him to have something that was entirely, purely his. But somewhere in that carefully maintained distance, a fracture had formed, one she hadn't anticipated. Because while she stayed hands-off with Daniel's career, she remained deeply, obsessively hands-on with the company itself. And when a $42,000 discrepancy appeared on the Simmons account, when the compliance team traced login credentials back to Daniel's terminal, she trusted the system she herself had built. She trusted Marcus Rain's report. She had not, in that moment, connected the dots the way she should have, because doing so would have meant admitting, even to herself, how much power she actually held over her husband's life. It would be weeks before she learned the truth, that Daniel's login credentials had been spoofed by a disgruntled junior analyst named Curtis Boyle, a man Daniel had written up for repeated policy violations just 2 months earlier. Curtis had accessed Daniel's terminal during a 5-minute window while Daniel was in the break room, rerouted the Simmons shipment as an act of petty sabotage, and covered his tracks well enough for a fool an initial compliance sweep. It was a misunderstanding in the truest, cruelest sense, an act of revenge that had landed on the wrong man entirely, dismantling a marriage's foundation of trust before anyone even knew it was cracking. But that discovery was still weeks away. In the meantime, Daniel was unemployed, humiliated, and increasingly desperate, watching his savings dwindle as he sent out resume after resume, each rejection chipping away at the man he used to be. And 2 months after his termination, when the mortgage payment on Larkspur Lane came due and the joint account fell short, Vivian did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She let him believe they were renting. Vivian hadn't meant it to unravel that way. In the early days of their marriage, when she had set up the joint account and told Daniel she'd handle the bills, she had done so because it was simpler for her to route mortgage payments through Meridian Hale Group's property arm without the paperwork trail leading straight back to her personal name. Larkspur Lane wasn't just their home. It was one of 43 residential properties Meridian Hale had acquired over the years as part of a long-term real estate portfolio, properties she leased out through a management subsidiary called Birchwood Realty Partners. She and Daniel didn't have a traditional mortgage at all. They had a lease agreement drawn up under Birchwood's name that Vivian had signed years ago, using a signature that didn't match the one on her driver's license, the looping old-fashioned V. Hale she'd used before she'd ever taken Daniel's last name. Daniel had never seen that lease. He'd never needed to. Vivian handled the mortgage payment every month, silently converting his contributions into rent, filtering the transaction through 3 layers of shell accounts before it ever touched Birchwood's books. To him, it looked exactly like a mortgage statement. The numbers were even similar to what a real mortgage might cost. It was a lie by omission, one she told herself was harmless because, in her mind, the house was theirs regardless of the paperwork. What did it matter whose name was on a deed, she reasoned, when the love inside those walls was real? But 2 months after Daniel lost his job, when he came to her with hollow eyes and said, "We're short on the mortgage this month, I don't know what to do," Vivian made a choice that would define everything that followed. Instead of telling him the truth, that she owned the house outright, that there was no bank breathing down their necks, that she could simply absorb the shortfall without either of them feeling a single ripple of consequence, she said, "I'll figure it out. Don't worry about it." And then, 3 weeks later, when the shortfall happened again, she didn't figure it out. She let the property management arm of Birchwood Realty Partners send a formal notice. She would later tell herself it was an accident, that she'd been buried in a due diligence process for Meridian Hale acquisition in Denver, flying back and forth, barely sleeping, and that the notice had gone out through the same automated system that flagged all 43 properties for payment delinquency. She would tell herself she never saw the notice before it was mailed, that by the time she found out, Daniel already had the envelope in his hands, his face the color of ash, sitting at their kitchen table with a letter that read, "Notice of Deficient Payment, Birchwood Realty Partners, LLC." "Vivian," he said, his voice barely above a whisper when she walked through the door that evening. "What is this?" She looked at the letter. She looked at her husband, and in that single suspended moment, she had a choice. The choice she would replay in her mind for months afterwards, turning it over like a stone worn smooth from handling. She could tell him everything. She could sit down, take his hands, and say, "Daniel, I own this house. I own the company that let you go. I've owned things you never knew about because I was afraid of what it would do to us if you did." Instead, she said, "It's a mistake. I'll call them tomorrow." She told herself it was because he was already so fragile, so worn down by the job loss, that adding this enormous, life-altering revelation would break something in him that couldn't be repaired. She told herself she needed the right moment, a calmer moment, a moment when he wasn't sitting across from an eviction notice with unemployment stretching behind him like a long gray road. But the right moment never came because the truth has a way of metastasizing in silence, growing heavier and more dangerous the longer it goes unspoken. Daniel, for his part, began to notice things, small things at first, the way Vivian tensed whenever he mentioned calling the mortgage company directly, the way she always intercepted the mail before he could sort through it, the way she'd started taking calls in the garage with the door shut, her voice dropping into a register he didn't recognize, clipped and businesslike in a way that didn't match the woman who cried during dog food commercials.
He tried calling Birchwood Realty Partners himself one afternoon while Vivian was at what she called a client dinner. He sat on hold for 11 minutes before a representative picked up, and when he asked to speak to someone about the deficiency notice on Larkspur Lane, the woman on the line asked for his name, then paused. "I'm sorry, sir, you're not listed as a leaseholder on this property. I can't discuss account details with you." "I understand your frustration, but our records show the lease is held solely under V. Hale. Is there someone else I can transfer you to?" Daniel sat very still after he hung up the phone. V. Hale. He turned the name over in his mind, searching for some innocent explanation, a relative perhaps, a business partner, a co-signer before their marriage. But something cold was beginning to uncoil in his chest, a suspicion he didn't yet have words for. He didn't confront her that night. He wasn't ready. Instead, he began, quietly and methodically, the way he'd always approached problems at work, to investigate. He requested copies of old bank statements. He dug through a filing cabinet in the garage that Vivian rarely touched, and beneath a stack of old tax documents, he found a folder labeled MHG, Confidential. Inside were shareholder agreements, quarterly earnings reports, and a corporate structure chart with a name at the very top of the ownership tree. Vivian R. Hale, 61% controlling interest, Meridian Hale Group. Beneath that page was another, a subsidiary list. Birchwood Realty Partners, Halden Freight Solutions, Cresthaven Logistics, 9 other names Daniel didn't know. He sat on the garage floor for a long time, the fluorescent light overhead humming faintly, and felt something inside him go very quiet and very cold. Every certainty he'd built his life around, that he was a self-made man, that his marriage was an equal partnership, that his home was his own, collapsed in the span of reading 11 pages of legal documents. He wasn't just an employee who'd been wrongfully fired. He was a man who had been living inside his wife's empire without knowing the walls around him were hers, who had been paying rent to her disguised as a mortgage, who had lost a job at a company she controlled, all while she said nothing. The anger came slower than he expected. First, there was only a profound, disorienting numbness, the sensation of the ground shifting beneath a house he thought was built on bedrock. He thought about all the nights she'd held him while he cried about the job loss, all the times she'd said, "They'll figure out it wasn't you," and he wondered with a nausea
That curled through his stomach, whether she had known all along that it wasn't him, whether she could have fixed it with a single phone call and chose not to. He didn't sleep that night. He lay beside her in the dark, listening to her breathing, feeling like he was lying next to a stranger wearing his wife's face. In the morning, he said nothing. He kissed her goodbye like any other day, watched her car pull out of the driveway, and then he sat down at the kitchen table with the folder in front of him and began making calls. He called Marcus Rain first, using a tone of calm authority he didn't entirely feel. "I need to know who ordered the compliance review on the Simmons account," he said. Marcus, caught off guard, stammered something about protocol before Daniel cut him off. "I have documentation showing Vivian Hale is the controlling shareholder of Halden Freight Solutions. I think you understand why I'm asking." There was a long silence on the line. "Mr. Cole, I wasn't aware you knew." "I didn't," Daniel said quietly. "Not until yesterday." He spent the rest of that day piecing together a timeline that made his chest ache with every new detail. How Curtis Boyle, the junior analyst he'd written up for repeated violations, had access to the server room the same week the Simmons account was compromised. How the compliance review had been rushed through in less than 8 hours, an unusually fast turnaround for what should have been a weeks-long investigation. How Marcus Rain had personally signed off on the termination without waiting for IT's forensic report, a report that, when Daniel finally got someone to email it to him, showed clearly that his login had been accessed from a terminal 3 floors away from where he'd been sitting that entire day. It wasn't Vivian who had fired him, not directly, but she was the woman who owned the ground he'd been standing on when it collapsed, and she had let him believe for 6 long years that the ground was something they'd built together.
That evening, when Vivian came home, she found Daniel sitting at the kitchen table with the MHG folder open in front of him, and the forensic IT report beside it, and the Birchwood Realty deficiency notice resting on top like a final piece of evidence in a trial only one of them had known was happening. "Vivian," he said, his voice steady in a way that frightened her more than shouting would have, "I think it's time you told me the truth. All of it." Vivian stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her keys still in her hand, and felt the entire architecture of her carefully constructed life give way beneath her. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind over the years, always in some hypothetical future, always with more time to prepare, always with softer lighting and gentler words. She had never imagined it would arrive like this. Her husband's face carved from stone, a folder of her own confidential documents spread across the table like an indictment only one of them had known was happening. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly, setting her keys down with a hand that trembled slightly. "Since last night," Daniel said. "But that's not the question that matters, Vivian. The question is how long you've known. About the job, about the house, about all of it." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly, the folder between them like a wall neither of them could see over. "The house I've known since the day we moved in," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I own it. I've always owned it. Birchwood Realty is mine, a subsidiary of Meridian Hale. I set up the lease that way because it was simpler for the accounting, and then it just became easier to let you think it was a mortgage. I told myself it didn't matter, that the house was ours regardless of what the papers said." "It matters," Daniel said, his voice cracking on the second word. "It matters because I've spent 6 years thinking we were building something together, brick by brick, payment by payment. And this whole time I was just, what? A tenant paying rent to my own wife without knowing it?" "You were never just a tenant," Vivian said, tears beginning to blur her vision. "This is your home, Daniel. I never once thought of you as—" "Then why didn't you tell me?" His voice rose now, the calm facade finally cracking. 6 years, Vivian. 6 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and late-night conversations about our future, and you let me believe I was contributing to something that was already entirely yours." She had no good answer, and she knew it. She thought of every excuse she'd rehearsed over the years, the ex-partner who tried to take everything from her, the fear of being loved for her assets instead of herself, the belief that timing would eventually present itself, and she understood, watching Daniel's face collapse into something between grief and fury, that none of those reasons would sound like anything but cowardice now. "And the company," Daniel continued, his hand coming down flat on the forensic IT report. "You own Halden Freight. You've owned it this whole time. I worked there for 4 years, Vivian. 4 years of 12-hour days, of turning down other offers because I believed in what we were building, and it was never we. It was you, watching from some tower I didn't even know existed, letting me think I'd earned every promotion on my own." "You did earn it," Vivian said, her voice breaking. "I swear to you, Daniel, I never once interfered, not with your hiring and not with your promotions, not with anything. I wanted you to have something that was purely yours, something I hadn't touched. That's the only gift I thought I could give you, distance. And when I got fired," his voice was a whisper now, more devastating than any shout could have been, "you let them destroy my reputation, Vivian. You let them accuse me of stealing $42,000 from a client, and you sat across from me every night for 2 months, holding my hand, telling me they'd figure it out, when you could have picked up a phone and fixed it in 5 minutes. "I didn't know," Vivian said, and for the first time, real desperation entered her voice. "Daniel, I swear to you, I didn't know it was a mistake until 3 days ago. I trusted the compliance report. I trusted Marcus. I never imagined—" "You never imagined checking?" Daniel's laugh was hollow, humorless. You own the company, Vivian. You could have asked one question, one single question, and you would have found out what I found out in an afternoon, that Curtis Boyle spoofed my login from a terminal 3 floors away from where I'd been sitting that entire day. Spite, because I wrote him up for stealing supplies. But you didn't ask because asking would have meant admitting to yourself and to me how much power you actually had over my life. The silence that followed stretched long and unbearable. Vivian pressed her palms against her eyes, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its composure entirely. "You're right," she said. "I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting what we had, but really I was protecting myself, from the fear that if you knew what I owned, what I controlled, you'd start to see me differently, or worse, that you'd start to see yourself differently, smaller, like everything you'd built was somehow borrowed from me." "I don't need you to protect me from the truth," Daniel said. "I needed you to trust me with it." He stood up from the table, and for a moment, Vivian thought he might walk out the door and never come back, thought that this was the ending she deserved, the natural conclusion to 6 years of careful, well-intentioned deception. But he didn't leave. He walked to the window instead, looking out at the maple tree Vivian had planted the year they'd moved in, its branches now thick and full after 6 years of growth. "I need space," he said, finally, not turning around. "Not forever, but I can't sit at this table tonight and pretend like I understand how to feel about any of this. I lost my job. I lost the last shred of dignity I had left, believing I was building a life with you as an equal. And I need to figure out who I am now that I know none of it was quite what I thought." Vivian nodded, though he couldn't see her, tears sliding freely down her face now. "Where will you go?" "I have a friend in Millbrook, Ray, from the old warehouse job. I'll stay with him for a while." He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes, though red-rimmed, held something steadier than she expected. Not hatred, but exhaustion, and beneath that, something that might have still been love, buried under the weight of betrayal. "You need to fix what happened at Halden Freight. Not for me. I don't think I could go back there even if you cleared my name 100 times over, but for the truth. Curtis Boyle needs to be held accountable, and Marcus Rain needs to answer for how fast he pushed through my termination without a real investigation." "I'll handle it. I promise you, Daniel. I'll handle it properly this time. No shortcuts. No hiding behind subsidiaries." He left that night with a single suitcase, and the house on Larkspur Lane, the home Vivian owned outright, suddenly felt larger and colder than it ever had before, its rooms echoing with an emptiness that no amount of square footage had ever caused when Daniel was in them. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Vivian's life, harder even than the early years of building Meridian Hail Group from a single delivery truck. She threw herself into unraveling the truth at Halden Freight with a ferocity that unsettled even her most seasoned executives. She brought in an independent forensic auditing team, bypassing Marcus Rain entirely, and within a week they confirmed everything Daniel had already discovered. Curtis's spoofed login, the rushed and inadequate investigation, Marcus's failure to verify the claims before pulling the termination trigger. Curtis was fired and referred for criminal prosecution on charges of fraud and unauthorized computer access. Marcus, after a tense closed-door meeting with Vivian that left him visibly shaken, resigned rather than face the disciplinary review she'd initiated. She drafted a formal letter of reinstatement for Daniel, offering not just his old position but a promotion to regional director, the role he'd been passed over 2 years earlier, along with full back pay for the months he'd been unemployed. She almost didn't send it, terrified it would look like she was trying to buy back his trust with a title and a paycheck. In the end, she sent it anyway, along with a second letter, this one personal, that took her 4 attempts to write without her handwriting shaking too badly to read. "Daniel, I'm not asking you to come back to Halden Freight, and I'm not asking you to come back to Larkspur Lane, though I hope more than anything that you eventually will. I'm only asking you to know this. Everything I built because I believed no one could take it from me if it was mine alone. I never understood until you left that the things worth building are the things you're brave enough to build together. I should have told you the truth on our wedding day. I should have told you every year after. I was so afraid of being loved for what I had that I nearly lost being loved for who I am. I'm sorry, Daniel. Whatever you decide, I'm sorry. V." Daniel read the letter sitting on Ray's back porch in Millbrook, the late afternoon sun slanting low across the yard, and he sat with it for a long time before folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket. He didn't call her that day, or the next, but 3 weeks later, when he finally did return to Larkspur Lane, it wasn't for the house, or the reinstatement letter, or even the maple tree in the front yard. It was because sitting alone in Ray's guest room each night, he'd realized that the 6 years of love between them, the late-night conversations, the quiet Sunday mornings, the way she still reached for his hand in her sleep, had been real, even if the paperwork beneath their life hadn't been honest. He knocked on the door of his own house like a stranger, and when Vivian opened it, her eyes swollen from weeks of sleepless nights, he said only, "We have a lot of rebuilding to do. Not the company, not the house, us." She nodded, unable to speak, and let him in. It would take months of careful, deliberate honesty to repair what silence had nearly destroyed. Joint counseling sessions, painful conversations about ownership and trust, and what partnership truly meant. A complete restructuring of their finances so that everything, from the deed to the house to Daniel's eventual return to a newly transparent Halden Freight, bore both their names plainly for anyone to see. Vivian learned slowly that real intimacy required more courage than empire building ever had, and Daniel learned that being loved as an equal meant more than being protected from difficult truths. Their marriage survived not because the secret was small, but because they chose in its aftermath to build something neither of them could hide inside of ever again.